Hannibal is, a quote, is telling his leadership in Carthage, thank you for the accolades. Thank you for the celebrations. We have inflicted numerous defeats on the Romans, but the Romans have never asked for a ceasefire. The Romans are not suing for peace, and thus our victories to this point are meaningless. His point was well taken. Unless you march right into Rome and ultimately crush the Romans, disperse the population, you're not going to defeat Rome. Well, the same is true for the Israelis. All they're doing is destroying infrastructure in Lebanon as well as in Gaza and probably eventually anywhere else that they decide to fight. And we'll talk about that because there is a plan. And that's to drive whoever lives there out of the country. That's the point. That's why you destroy infrastructure, hospitals, buildings of all kinds and types. You're driving out the population. This is part of the Greater Israel Project.
Good evening and welcome to today's in-depth report. We're diving into the unfolding geopolitical chess game between Israel, Iran, and the broader Middle East. Tensions are running high with recent retaliatory strikes and signals from global powers shaping the narrative. What's really going on behind these seemingly small escalations? Let's break down the situation step by step. Last week, Israeli forces launched a series of precision attacks on Iranian military installations. The targets included air defense systems and troop facilities across multiple locations designed to cause disruption without triggering full-scale conflict. According to initial reports, these strikes resulted in the deaths of 2 Iranian soldiers and inflicted damage on a strategic radar unit critical to Iran's early warning system. The strikes were carried out with unmanned aerial vehicles UAVs, 2 of which detonated near Iranian military camps, causing limited explosions. While the damage was localized, the psychological impact goes beyond physical destruction. For Iran, it demonstrates that even their hardened military zones are vulnerable to infiltration and precision strikes. UAVs have increasingly become a central element of Israel's defense strategy, offering high mobility and operational flexibility without putting human lives at risk. However, what stands out about this incident is the restraint that followed. No broader escalation took place and no further military operations were launched, leading many experts to conclude that Israel's strike was more symbolic than strategic. Analysts suggest 2 possible motives. Either Israel was probing Iran's defenses to assess gaps in their air defense grid, or it intended to send a political message to Tehran reminding them of Israel's operational reach. This small-scale attack raises important questions. Is Israel seeking to avoid an open conflict while still maintaining pressure on Iran? Or is it testing the waters for future operations? The minimal footprint of the strike suggests a calculated message, carefully balancing the need to demonstrate military capability without provoking an all-out retaliation. Some commentators believe this was a preview of how Israel will engage in future conflicts, short, surgical operations with high political impact. But the real question isn't just about Israel's intentions, it's also about how Iran, the US, and the global community are interpreting these moves. In response to Israel's strikes, Iran chose a path of calculated restraint. Officials in Tehran made it clear that any decision to retaliate would come from the highest levels of leadership, signaling that Iran is weighing its options carefully. This measured approach contrasts sharply with the rhetoric often associated with Tehran, suggesting that the regime may be biding its time for a more favorable opportunity to respond. This response, or lack thereof, raises several strategic questions. Was Iran's restraint a signal of vulnerability, or was it a tactical decision to avoid further escalation? By not activating their air defense systems during the UAV attacks, Iran might have been attempting to conceal the full extent of their air defense capabilities. Alternatively, it could indicate that Israel's UAVs evaded detection altogether, raising concerns about the effectiveness of Iran's defense grid. Moreover, Iran's strategic silence reflects a keen understanding of regional geopolitics. With multiple fronts to manage ranging from Syria to Iraq and Yemen, Iran's leadership may be opting for patience, waiting for the right opportunity to respond without overextending their military resources. This restraint also positions Tehran as a calculated actor on the global stage, signaling to its allies and rivals alike that it won't be drawn into conflict on unfavorable terms. Some analysts argue that Iran's response, or lack thereof, is aimed at avoiding any misstep that could justify a broader conflict with Israel or invite further US involvement in the region. Others believe Iran is simply playing the long game, knowing that retaliatory options remain on the table. While Tehran's immediate reaction was muted, history shows that Iran rarely forgets or forgives perceived provocations. It may be only a matter of time before we see a response, and the delay might be a strategy in itself. While Tehran weighs its options, the situation grows more complex as international powers start to make their voices heard. Israel's latest military maneuvers cannot be viewed in isolation. They are deeply entangled with the political timelines of both Israel and the United States. With critical elections on the horizon, it's hard to ignore the timing and nature of these operations. These strikes serve multiple functions, beyond just addressing immediate security threats. They appear to be part of a calculated strategy to bolster political narratives domestically and internationally. Domestically, the Israeli government seeks to strengthen its position in an increasingly fragmented political environment. Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition is under immense pressure, and national security remains one of the few cards that can rally public support. In the United States, President Joe Biden faces a challenging re-election campaign, and his administration's unwavering support for Israel aims to secure backing from pro-Israel voters, a critical demographic in battleground states. Experts argue that these military actions are more about optics than operational necessity. The strikes offer leaders in both countries a chance to project strength, reinforcing their political narratives ahead of the elections. Israel positions itself as a country that acts decisively to defend its people, while Biden's administration emphasizes its commitment to key allies, reassuring voters that the U.S. remains a steadfast supporter of Israel in a volatile region. Douglas Macgregor has previously warned that intertwining military actions with political objectives can have long-term diplomatic consequences, making future negotiations more challenging. When military maneuvers are used to achieve political ends, the risk of miscalculation increases, potentially leading to unintended escalation. This fusion of political and military agendas highlights a key dynamic. Every move in the geopolitical chessboard has dual significance, one for security and another for elections. As the political climate heats up, both Israel and the U.S. may lean on similar tactics, further blurring the line between defense policy and electoral strategy. What we are seeing here is not just military posturing, but also a performance tailored for political survival. But how are these political games being received by Iran's allies in the broader Middle East? The regional response to Israel's latest strike has been mixed, with many labeling it as symbolic and ineffective. Observers across the political spectrum, both in the West and the Middle East, agree that the operation lacked the impact necessary to achieve its intended objectives. While the strikes demonstrated Israel's reach, they have done little to alter the strategic calculus in the region. In Iran, the response from citizens has been filled with satire. Across social media platforms, Iranians have ridiculed the strikes, drawing comparisons to mythical characters like Sun Wukong, who searches for an enemy that barely exists. These memes reflect a broader sentiment: the UAV attacks failed to deliver any meaningful blow to Iran's military or its strategic assets. This public sentiment highlights a critical issue. While Israel intended to send a powerful message, the response it provoked suggests that the strikes have been perceived as weak. In a region where perception often matters more than reality, the apparent ineffectiveness of the strikes could undermine Israel's deterrent strategy. Critics argue that such operations, when poorly executed, risk emboldening Iran rather than deterring it. At the same time, the strikes have raised questions about Israel's overall military posture. Are these limited operations part of a broader strategy, or are they a reflection of dwindling options? Analysts note that if Israel's goal was to intimidate Iran and demonstrate strength to the international community, the results have fallen short. Such symbolic gestures may even backfire, diminishing Israel's strategic leverage in future confrontations. Douglas Macgregor has noted that military operations perceived as weak can invite further challenges, as regional actors may interpret them as signs of declining strength or indecisiveness. As perceptions shift, the narrative around Israel's actions becomes more complex. In a volatile region where every move is scrutinized and every statement analyzed, Israel now faces a new challenge: how to reclaim the narrative and rebuild its deterrence in the eyes of both its allies and adversaries. But as public sentiment shifts, another key player in the region, North Korea, is quietly making its moves. North Korea's recent military maneuvers reveal a growing partnership with Russia, with reports suggesting Pyongyang may provide military assets or personnel to aid Russia in the Ukraine conflict. While these developments may appear distant, their ripple effects are already being felt across Asia, particularly in South Korea. Seoul now finds itself on edge, concerned that increased North Korean engagement in distant conflicts could spill over into heightened regional tensions back home. This intersection of North Korea's arms production and the Ukraine conflict carries significant geopolitical risks. South Korea views Pyongyang's involvement as a troubling escalation, potentially destabilizing the precarious balance on the Korean peninsula. North Korea's willingness to export arms or align militarily with Russia not only strengthens Russia's position, but also adds pressure on South Korea to recalibrate its own defense posture. And that fear isn't just limited to the Korean Peninsula, it extends to Israel and its calculation of how to manage multiple fronts. Israel's current strategy reflects a doctrine known as limited warfare. Rather than deploying fighter jets for large-scale airstrikes, Israel has opted for UAVs and drones, carefully calibrated strikes that allow it to achieve tactical and political objectives while minimizing the risk of all-out war. These operations allow Israel to send clear messages to adversaries like Iran while avoiding heavy international backlash. This strategy not only serves military objectives but also tests diplomatic waters. Israel measures its adversaries' responses, knowing that every action carries geopolitical consequences. Limited warfare enables Israel to maintain strategic ambiguity, pushing boundaries without breaking them. The avoidance of red lines is deliberate, reducing the risk of direct Iranian retaliation while still reinforcing Israel's regional dominance. But as Israel treads this fine line, the role of the US and other global actors becomes even more critical. The alliance between the US and Israel remains central to both nations' strategic interests. The United States continues to act as a vital anchor for Israel, providing financial, military, and diplomatic support. However, this relationship also carries risks, as both countries operate in a highly volatile region where miscalculations can quickly spiral into conflict. With elections looming in both nations, decisions are carefully choreographed to serve domestic and international interests. The Biden administration's unwavering support for Israel sends a powerful signal to Iran and other regional players, but it's also aimed at securing key voter blocs back home. Balancing military necessity with political strategy remains a tightrope walk for both countries, as one misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Douglas Macgregor has emphasized that the fusion of military policy with electoral strategy complicates decision-making, increasing the potential for unintended escalation. And as we look ahead, the stakes for Israel, Iran, and their global allies continue to rise. So where does this leave us? Israel's recent actions reflect a broader strategy, one that balances military assertiveness with political maneuvering. Iran's calculated restraint suggests that Tehran is playing a long game, waiting for the right moment to retaliate. With tensions simmering and the stakes higher than ever, the question remains, will these calculated moves lead to a new era of geopolitical realignment, or are we on the brink of another Middle Eastern conflict? Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for more in-depth coverage and analysis of the latest geopolitical developments. Don't forget to subscribe, and hit the bell icon to stay updated.